Welcome to Wavelengths, a podcast with Amphenol Broadband Solutions.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Wavelengths, an Amphenol Broadband Solutions podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B. And folks, thanks so much for joining us on another episode of the show, both our legacy listeners and our new listeners. If this is your first time, then we're excited to welcome you to some of the best thought leadership in the larger telecom industry. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us as we dive deep into the news, the trends, the technologies, and the market forces that are shaping the evolving telecom industry. And as you follow along with our conversation today, make sure you're heading to our website, amphenolbroadband.com. Again, that's amphenolbroadband.com for more resources and more information about our solutions and services, but also for some more content, including episodes of the show and other blogs, videos, you name it. And you can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. So just hit that subscribe button and you'll have a full catalog of previous conversations plus notifications when we drop new episodes of the show. All right, folks, let's jump into it. There's a lot to unpack on today's episode of Wavelengths. So here's a little bit of context. In late 2021, as one of the Biden administration's first pieces of landmark legislation, we saw the passing of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, right? Now, this intended to invest significant capital into a revitalization of U.S. infrastructure and the creation of new productive positions for U.S. labor. Part of the funding from this Jobs Act is set aside specifically for broadband infrastructure development. This is something we've covered on the podcast before, but it takes the form of two unique programs: the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, otherwise known as BEAD, and the Affordable Connectivity Program, otherwise known as ACP. So today's episode of the show, in similar fashion to previous episodes of the show, is going to be a policy-based deep dive. We're going to be unpacking the set of federal funding initiatives created to support the expansion of broadband initiatives across the U.S. and specifically for underserved and rural areas. We'll analyze the basics, right? The implementation timelines, when the larger industry should come to expect, or what they should come to expect from this round of funding. And like most federal funding, the results don't come from the money itself, but from how it's spent, right? So we'll do an analysis of the proposed deployments for BEAD and ACP, what works, what may prove to be inefficient or challenging to actually fully realize. And then we'll also give some analysis on what ISP decision makers can do about all of this funding, right, to make sure that the funds are deployed in a way that actually increases access and quality of broadband internet as it's deployed across the U.S. So I'm excited to welcome our guest. That's enough intro from me. For insights and a comprehensive breakdown of this funding, I'm pleased to welcome our guest for the episode, Mr. Ben Elkins. He's CEO of AireBeam. AireBeam is a rising Arizona-based fiber to the home and fixed wireless internet provider. And Ben sports a 20-plus year career in telecom with previous roles as a VP of sales and COO at Voce Telecom. He has an extensive knowledge of all things telecom, from business development to tech, and has secured many major domestic and international deals in his tenured career. Ben, great to have you on the show. How you doing today,
Great,
man?
Daniel. Thanks for having me on. It's been a real pleasure. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. It's always great, getting to sit down with other executives in I'm not an executive myself, but you know what I mean. Sitting down with executives in the larger telecom industry to, get their analysis, but also some anecdotal perspectives on how, this often very large scale funding that impacts ISPs, states, municipalities, how it's being interpreted by one operation and one thought leader in the industry. So I appreciate you sitting down with us and giving us your perspectives. Real quick, I gave a basic intro there for our audience, but anything else you'd like to mention and, in terms of your career, your experience, and how it relates to the topic at hand?
Sure.
Today?
No, like you said, I am a 20-plus year veteran. I was with the GP Voice Telecom for 20 years and Boston Omaha Corp, who owns AireBeam. We purchased AireBeam in 2021, just same as the infrastructure bill, actually, as Silicon Side. They brought me on about 8 months ago to grow AireBeam and to really set it on fire as far as rural Arizona. We're not trying to be everything to everyone, but we are trying to be Arizona's #1 rural internet provider and fiber to the home, and which meshes great with BEAD and ACP since much of Arizona, especially in the rural areas, are neglected as far as the ISPs go because of the cost and different matters. And we really think that the infrastructure bill got it right with the funds that they're allowing BEAD to make these rural areas and give access to the folks that need it most. So we're really excited about both these programs.
Yeah, and that angle is important, right? AireBeam exists because it is filling a very specific market need and is trying to establish itself as the trusted provider for rural Arizona. And so, I think that speaks a lot to why this funding is needed in the first place. And I'm excited to pull from that perspective as one of the providers, that is hopefully set to benefit the most from this kind of funding, how you are interpreting the funding, its utility, and maybe some challenges. So let's jump into it. As explained by Pew here, this is Pew's definition. The BEAD program, quote, is more than $42 billion to construct broadband networks, establish subsidies to offset the cost of internet service for lower income households, and create programs to provide end users with the devices and training they need to use the new and upgraded networks, end quote. So there's a lot there that BEAD is meant to cover. Could you get into just more detail for our audience here today? What is the BEAD program, just in more detail, and how does it try to address the digital divide in the United States and achieve some of those various goals?
For sure. And Pew had a good definition there, actually. That was pretty good. It's really designed to establish broadband networks, right, for the unserved and underserved areas, for residents all over the communities to receive high-speed internet, high-speed fiber internet, really. There are too many rural areas in this country where it's just not feasible for the ISPs to go in there and build out fiber networks in the middle of rural America. So that's where BEAD steps in to help the ISPs provide the fast fiber networks in those areas, and it should allow, if BEAD is operated correctly, which I think it will be, every community will have access to high-speed internet, which is the goal of BEAD, and I think they'll be successful at this.
And BEAD actually plans to divvy out funding based on, various, quote, formula-based allocations. So this is an attempt for BEAD funding to be equitable and to divvy up, as much as several $billion seems like a lot of funding. When you are deploying expensive infrastructure across the whole of the United States, deploying that funding intentionally and very specifically matters a lot. So some of the allocations are minimum allocations, high cost allocations, and remaining funds. So real quick for our audience, I'll break those down. Minimum is that each U.S. state is getting $100 million, just period, to invest in their expanded broadband infrastructure. This includes D.C. and Puerto Rico. We're also getting $25 million for other U.S. territories in that ecosystem. There's also high cost allocations. So these are going to be more specific allocations for underserved areas where development of broadband infrastructure is particularly costly. And this is because of the breadth of development needed. It's just a huge undertaking. Then there will be remaining funds, which is going to be state-by-state allocations based on more specific extra areas of need for developing expanded broadband infrastructure. So this funding is going to be facilitated by the NTIA. And I'm curious your thoughts on sort of that structure there, right? What are your thoughts on that approach to breaking up the funding based on different tiers? And honestly, even specifically, the NTIA's role in deploying those funds. What's y'all's assessment?
Great question. So let's start with the first part there on the different allocations of the funds. So they are breaking out in kind of three categories, right? The lower cost funding will go to the areas that are easier builds for the ISPs. So for an example, I know you're in Texas. Let's say we have an area outside of Dallas that might have been forgotten about. Maybe it's between Dallas and the Oklahoma border. It's rural, but it's still, let's say, a community's there that has 3,000 or 4,000 homes, but they're all close together. It's not an extremely hard build, but for whatever reason, the ISPs just neglected it, didn't want to service it for whatever reason. they'll be qualified for more of the lower cost, lower tiered funding. And then let's say, for instance, you're in the middle of swampland, Florida, that nothing lives there but alligators, right? And there's some homes in some areas. They're going to be hard to get. You're going to have a much more difficult build to get to those areas. So for those, you're going to have more money allocated for those type of areas. And then they're also going to have money allocated for middle mile and different projects as well. And middle mile is just getting the infrastructure to those folks. So they'll be able to do that as well. So grand scheme, every state has been allocated money based on the FCC map. And BEAD did it really smart, and I'm sure we'll get into a little deeper later, but they did it a lot different than some of the other programs. They really spent a lot of time and detail going through the map to design it so each state could get the allocated funds. Like I know, and each state gets different funds. I know in Texas, I believe, I think it was over $100 billion was the number for the state of Texas, or $100 million. I'm sorry, for the state of Texas, just in one county. So it was interesting how they break it down county by county, state by state. So there's going to be a lot of different measurements on how they do it, but there's plenty of money for each state to service every area, and we're all excited about it. Second piece, let me get to. I'm sorry, the second piece of your question, the NTIA. So this was great too. Okay, so you have the NTIA and BEAD, and you actually have them working together, and this is perfect. You have states and government working together, which a lot of times doesn't happen in our society. So this is really, really good. And NTIA was really smart. They gave each state upfront money to create two things. They got them to have office space and then get personnel. And what this allowed them to do was it allowed them to create directors of broadbands and different folks to go out and meet the communities, meet the ISPs, and really get to know them and figure out where the needs were and where the real problem areas and how we could help the different states and different counties, different communities, and then figure out firsthand, okay, what ISPs could really be qualified to do this, and then what communities could be matching up well with them. So really smart that they have both entities working together on this. For instance, on the previous other plans that maybe not work so well, like RDOF. RDOF was a national program that didn't have any real state influence on that. And they had a huge mapping problem too. The data was really, really bad on the map. So they had all kinds of faults and problems from the get-go. BEAD has gone about totally different. And I think because of that, BEAD's going to be a lot more successful.
I'm glad you brought that up. I'm actually going to follow up on that point and dig a little deeper into the distinctions here in a second. But I first want to ask a follow-up here. So again, one of the tiers for funding allocation is the remaining funds, right? And these are state by state, but they're based on, more specific extra needs that are very state specific. I'm curious if you could give us some examples of what that looks like in Arizona, right? What are some of the specific challenges Arizona is going to have to face, whether that has to do with, the geography, the actual process of laying down fiber, or if it has to do with some of the dynamics between federal and state in Arizona. Thoughts?
So Arizona, as you all know, has a lot of people moving here every day. Just in Maricopa County, we have 350 people move here every single day. It's a huge state for a lot of great reasons. It's a great place to live. So part of the extra funds will go for building out infrastructure where they think that people will be moving to and kind of get ahead of the game. We're also building an infrastructure highway throughout the state that's being funded as well. So there'll be some funds allocated to that, and for middle mile connecting, different areas of rural areas to make it have build in some redundancy. So we're really excited about having the extra funds, and I believe there will be extra funds to do those projects. And also there'll be some funds allocated for the tribal communities as well through that.
And we'll, I don't know, maybe I'm pitching this live to Wavelengths and ABS, but maybe we could do an episode in the future where we, once we start seeing some of that funding deployed, have you sit down with some other executives in different states and kind of cross compare what some of the challenges and solutions have been to deploying for those specific needs. Because I think that's really going to define the success of these funds, is being able to identify what those specific needs are in each state and addressing them with the future in mind, especially, with your example, more and more people moving to the state. Who knows, is that trend going to sustain or change in the next, 4 to 6 years as this infrastructure gets deployed? Hard to say. I'm sure the folks deploying it are doing that analysis and are going to try to keep that in mind as it gets deployed. But, those are the considerations to keep in mind. Okay, next question here. The funding allocations, it said, are also going to be based on the FCC's new 2022 allocation maps. You kind of brought this up earlier. These were met with, some applause, some critique when they were initially released. What was your take on them, and how effective do you think they'll be in helping facilitate BEAD funding in their current iteration?
So, great question again. BEAD did in conjunction with the FCC, did a map, and I thought they did a really good job. The map is in great detail. Again, I thought they did a much better job at going about this in RDOF. Were there challenges? Yes. So we had a challenge process that was due, I believe, at the end of December, early January, and there were some ISPs that maybe didn't have the accurate information on the map. So other companies and other personnel challenged the map, and some won, some lost. And there was a challenge process. It was great. It had state, it had communities, and the government all working together to get the most accurate of maps. And then they finalized that map. And I believe there's one more challenge still to come to finalize that. So they're giving folks the opportunity where if they're not happy with the map, they can challenge. And a lot of states were challenging. So nothing's perfect, right? But this is so much better than it was before. So I'm looking at it what it was, 2 years ago to what it is now, and they've made great strides in that. I think, the other cool thing that with the map, it gives you great detail for an ISP. So I can go into the FCC map now, and I can say, gosh, look at community A, and I'll say, you know what, this whole area is underserved, and this fits our footprint. This could be a great area for us to do business in and help that community out. Because at the end of the day, as an owner and a CEO of an ISP, what we really want to do is service our customers, take care of them, and provide the best quality service so they can have the best service at home and have quality high-speed internet for their families. And if there's an area in a community we can get that to, that's a win-win for everyone. So that the FCC map does great details for that, and it's excellent.
And you've drawn this distinction a few times now. I'm going to go ahead and hit on it. How would you say the BEAD program differs from previous initiatives like RDOF that attempted to expand broadband access? And also, compared to some of the other grants that were part of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act early on, like there were some digital equity grants, tribal connectivity grants, ones that are more focused on industry, so telemedicine, middle mile logistics grants, right? There's so many different iterations of deploying funds for improving broadband equity that it's kind of hard to keep track of all of them, honestly. So how would you say the BEAD program compares to some of those previous iterations, but more specifically RDOF?
Sure. One thing that is huge, I think that, RDOF was just a federal grant, right? And, RDOF had a few flaws actually, but one of them, I think they picked a lot of winners and they didn't vet out the ISPs and I think some of the ISPs got, not maybe too rambunctious, but they got over their head a little bit on being able to service the amount of customers. So they might have thought, gosh, I really want this grant in this area. And then they went, oh my gosh, what did I get myself into? So I think the BEAD has done an extremely good job of vetting, and they're doing a good job of vetting all the ISPs to make sure, hey, they're financially able to provide the service. They've been in business for X amount of years. They have a local footprint, stuff like that makes a lot of sense that, hey, if we're going to award you this money, we want to make sure that the customers actually get serviced and they can provide this. They also incorporate a matching concept. So anyone that applies for a BEAD fund must match up to 25% of the grant themselves. So they have to actually have that capital ready to go. And I think that's an important part to actually have some skin in the game. So us as an ISP, and we're partnering with the state and the government, and it's all three of us working together to, at the end of the day, provide that end user the best service possible. So I think that's a cool component as well. You mentioned the tribal broadband program. So that was a $3 billion program, and $1 billion of it did get funded already. And a lot of the tribal communities did receive that money. They do need still assistance from ISPs to help implement that money and put it into play. The other $2 billion that is left is into this infrastructure bill and will get dispersed soon as well. So that will be a huge addition because the tribal communities are some of the most needy of these of the fiber networks in their communities. So that will be a great help for them as well.
And let's expand on that too, considering that's one of the markets that AireBeam is poised to best serve with this funding. How is the BEAD program pitching itself as structured to work with states, local communities, right, tribal communities, to identify the areas that have the greatest need for broadband access, and what kind of projects do you imagine that BEAD funding will support? Right, beyond just the fact that maybe they have a better map system than RDOF did when it was initially launched, right? What are some of the strategies that the BEAD program has in mind for connecting with and actually working, more bilaterally with these communities?
So each state has its own director of broadband, and they are
Great, yeah,
hugely influential in talking with the communities and talking with the ISPs and bridging the gaps with the communities. And the tribal councils are involved with this director. So I know in Arizona, our director of broadband has talked to every mayor, town manager in the state, finding out their needs, and then they go to the tribal commissions and say, okay, how much money have you received? How much money more do you need? What does it take to build out your community? And then they're going back to the board and figuring out, okay, we need X amount of dollars. How do we get this for them? And that's going to be part of the BEAD fund as well. And some of the tribal communities already are funded, like I mentioned, but they haven't been able to implement it yet. It's one thing to get an X amount of dollars to say, okay, I'm ready to serve my community. I have $20 million, right? And I want to serve the community and get all the high-speed internet to everyone. But how do I do that? It's not just easy to throw some servers up and start an ISP. So then you got to be able to get an ISP to come to your land and say, okay, how do I build this out, and can I build this to my community? So one, you got to get the funds. That's the most important thing. Then you have to actually get an ISP to come there and build it out for you. So I think that's the one thing that BEAD's doing, is bridging those two together and allowing that marriage to happen. So I think that's going to be a huge impact for the tribal communities going forward. And I look forward to seeing that, because I know in Arizona there are a lot of tribes that need help and need assistance, and fiber to the home would be a great start. And you mentioned telemedicine and different things like that. I mean, COVID showed us that, right? So many more people now working from home. There's a security issue, there's a safety issue. Safety with the Ring cameras. Communication with the schools are always calling and over voice over IP. All these things need high-speed internet and broadband, and BEAD's going to allow to bridge this all together. So really exciting time for everyone in the state of Arizona and in the country, to be honest with you.
and it's important to note too that BEAD funding deployment is a multi-year process. So we're in one part of the process, and it's going to continue for several years, at least through 2026. But again, BEAD funding deployment is a multi-year process. The timeline started in 2022 with a notice of funding opportunities and the typical sort of letter of intent application process that many folks may already be used to. That's not a particularly new setup. But we're currently in the phase where 5-year implementation plans are being submitted, along with initial proposals for how and where this funding would even be deployed. Can you give us an update on that timeline from your perspective, right? What sorts of proposals are you hearing about? from industry colleagues, whether in Arizona or otherwise?
So I think a lot of the ISPs, from an ISP's perspective, right now they're looking in their communities, in their backyards, and saying, okay, what areas in our footprint can we service and have help from BEAD to allow us to reach some folks that maybe we weren't able to a year ago because we thought, gosh, it's just too expensive. It didn't make mathematical sense. So right now we're out looking for different areas for that. First and foremost, we're working with our broadband director to say, hey, what areas would you recommend that we take a look at? Because they're meeting with everyone. And then I think that as us as an ISPs, we're also looking to figure out, okay, the process starts. We have to figure out what areas we want to bid on, right? And then we have to figure out, okay, we need to have the funds allocated for that project. So we're getting all that in line. We're getting grant writers in place because it is a daunting task to write these grants. And then they have a bunch of smart things we have to get in order as far as being compliant and that sort of thing. So we're getting all of our ducks in a row as an ISP. And I think the states and then the government are doing the same. They're getting the allocated funds. They're finishing up the FCC maps. So the states are still working on collecting and getting the final total of how much money they're going to have to allocate. So from a state perspective, they're working with the NTIA, figuring out, hey, do I have $700 million? Do I have $900 million? What's the amount of dollars I have to spend? So they're working through that, and that goes through the challenge process. And once the final challenge process is over, they'll figure out how much money they actually have in the state. And then once they have that, then they get a better idea of how much funds they actually have to disperse. And then they'll be able to work on that and the extra funds. So a lot of stuff going on right now from an ISP perspective and a state perspective.
And what are some anecdotal examples, too, of just how AireBeam specifically is maneuvering the current point in the timeline?
So for us, we are pretty aggressive. We're meeting with a lot of towns, mayors. We're meeting with town managers. We're meeting with community members, community leaders, tribal leaders, and trying to figure out what's the best play for AireBeam. We want to service every single community we can, which makes sense. In our footprint, we are blessed to have our own construction teams. We have a good footprint throughout rural Arizona. So we'll be active in the bidding process, and we're looking forward to it. There'll be some competition, but I think that we'll be a good fit for a lot of the different communities in the state of Arizona. So we're looking forward to it, trying to get everything in line. But strategy-wise, we're just going through the process, trying to make sure that we're ready for it, planning for it, equipment-wise, personnel-wise, and all that good stuff.
All right, Ben. Well, we have plenty to still break down about BEAD funding and ACP funding as well, but there's only so much time for each podcast. So what we're going to do is we're going to pause here and actually break this up into two parts. So this will be the end of part one, and folks listening will be continuing our conversation on BEAD funding, ACP funding, how to get involved with the process, and how to strategize around all this federal funding here very soon. But till then, we've been chatting with Ben Elkins, CEO of AireBeam. Ben, it's been great chatting so far. I'm looking forward to following back up here soon. But until then, where can folks learn a little bit more about AireBeam, maybe catch up on some of your presence in the Arizona community so they're more informed when they come back for part two?
Well, it's been a pleasure, Daniel. Thank you again. As far as AireBeam, website's the best spot. We have a great website. It's www.airbeam.com. You can go on there. We have a big ad on the ACP on our front page and all the information about our fiber products and our fixed wireline products as well as some information about Boston Omaha, our parent company.
Perfect. Ben, thanks again for your time. We'll chat again soon. I'm really looking forward to it.
Thanks, Daniel. Really appreciate it.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning into this part one of two of Wavelengths, an Amphenol Broadband Solutions podcast. Make sure that you're subscribing on Apple Podcasts and Spotify for that part two, and head to our website, amphenolbroadband.com, for more on our company and more great content resources. I'm your host, Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B, and we'll catch you on the next episode of Wavelengths.